Great. Thanks everyone for joining us today for the Creative Approaches to Public Health seminar series. I'm Chloe Asker, a research fellow based at the University of Exeter, and it's a real pleasure to have with us today Yessica Mestre, who's a research associate at Lancaster University with over 9 years experience addressing health inequalities through qualitative, participatory, and trauma-informed methodologies. She's worked across Europe and Latin America on projects advancing gender justice, mental health equity, and depathologizing approaches in public health. Yessica is a former Marie Curie Fellow and brings a care-centered intersectional lens to her work with a strong focus on co-production and ethical engagement with vulnerable communities. Today, Yessica is talking about holding space, trauma-informed approaches in creative public health research, and I'd like to pass over to Yessica now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I want to talk about what it means to hold space in research, and not just as a metaphor, but as a real commitment to work with vulnerability, with care, and with creativity. So, in this talk, I want to talk about how we design research that doesn't just collect data, but also a research that is able to create trust, safety, and something that I have realized in my work is a research that is able to open a space for healing. So why this matters? In public health, we often work with people who carry experiences of trauma and discrimination and marginalization. And traditional research methods, colonizing research methodologies, how I like to prefer to talk about it, are sometimes they don't give people the tools to tell their stories in their own way. So these methods, we know that they ask for structure, they ask for clarity, for rationality when you are implementing the methodologies. But real life is emotional, is messy, and is complex. So for me, creative methods offer something different. They can make a space for emotion, for memory, for imagination. And I think that's essential when we're doing in public health trauma-informed work. So today, I want to talk or walk through you around trauma-informed principles and how creative research methods can work together around, and how we can build safer practices when it comes to public health research. So, what does holding space mean? So, holding a space means being present for someone without judgment, without pressure, and without interruption. So, in research, this means offering emotional safety and flexibility, and it means honoring people, how people want to share their experiences, how they in the way that they want to do it. So, creative methods help us hold that space in ways that traditional methods often can't do it. This is a quote of one of my research that it really stood with me, and is I couldn't talk about it, but when drew it, everything came out. So this is about holding a space, being ready to meet the people where they are, and give them the creativity to go around it. Okay, so ethical foundations. So or ethical frameworks like, I don't know, Belmont Report or Helsinki Declaration, they give us a foundation, but trauma-informed care approaches, I think it asks us to go deeper. So are we protecting people's dignity? Are we giving them choices? Are we doing more than just no harm? Are we offering something good? So I think that here is where creativity becomes part of our ethical toolkit. I think it's a way to allow for self-expression, for autonomy, for inclusion, especially for people that do not feel comfortable with formal interviews. So for me, creative methods is not just about being innovate, but it's about being human. And I think that's why I related so much in how we approach our ethical foundations. So, of course, it's a human rights-based approach that is involving the people in the design of the research questions, how I'm using an accessible language, how I'm sharing findings with the community, and making sure that the participation is meaningful, it's not symbolic. So in one of my studies, for example, we translated materials into community preferred terms. Also, we check with participants before publishing the quotes. And it's not just as a nice gesture, but I think it's about protecting the right to define how they are represented. Trauma-informed principles, I think that it's something that we need to have in every part of our research, like the safety, the trust, the transparency, the choice, the collaboration. So I think in practice, it means giving people the time and the space in the interview. If I'm allowing a break, if I'm letting someone express themselves, for example, they want to do it through drawing in case they don't feel comfortable with words. One participant in my research, for example, they drew he drew an abstract image of his experience with the healthcare system. So he couldn't explain it in words, but then the drawing said everything. And I think that's what trauma-informed choice is giving the person the control over how they share those experiences. When it comes to ethics of care, I think this one is very close to my heart because it's shifting the focus from the rules to relationships. So I think it's asking ourselves, are we being kind? Are we being present? Are we responding to people, not just to protocols? So I think ethics of care, the researcher cannot be just distant and neutral, how academia usually tell us that we have to be, because we need to be accountable of how we can affect the people. So it means checking after a person after a tough interview. It means being flexible. It means saying, it's okay if you want to stop. I'm here either way. I'm not going to leave right now if you don't want to present the interview. So I think that's for me ethics of care. Yeah. And that shows that caring for somebody is not unprofessional. In the opposite side is being responsible with the participants of your research. And finally, creativity as an ethical practice. And I think that creative methods like drawing, poetry, storytelling, they are not just tools, but I think they're a way of giving people voice and agency and dignity. And I think they let participants express themselves in emotional ways, in ways that make them feel, for example, more comfortable or discussing topics that are traumatic for them, and they cannot do it in words. So I have, for example, in one of my projects, someone couldn't say certain things out loud because they were like very traumatizing. So we managed that he did it through a poem and rearranged in something powerful, and that he felt safe, And it was, I remember in the moment he told me that it was a way that he felt that he was claiming the story for him. So besides being research, is what I found that it was also healing. So what I want you just to have in mind that choosing creative methods is an ethical decision, or at least for me, it's an ethical decision. So for me, it's saying like, you don't have to fit into my structure as a researcher, but I will meet you where you are. That's what create methods means. And I think all these frameworks help us to hold a space that is not just for data, but the space for people. And they ask us to slow down and to be present and to remember that research isn't central and that it can also harm, as history has told us about it. But research, and for me, creative methods, it can also heal. So these are some challenges in public research with vulnerable, when I have been working with vulnerable communities. And I think one of the main challenges that I have seen is that we risk re-traumatizing people if we are not careful. Yeah. So this is a quote again of my warrior that stood with me. They wanted to hear about my trauma, but they didn't know how to sit with it. And I really want to emphasize here that something that is not always talked about enough for me, and especially in the context of public health and research creative methods, and is when you open a space for creative expression, whether with every method that you are choosing for the community, drawing, poetry, you can also open the door to things that are emotional and that are raw and that sometimes are, or the majority of the times, are overwhelming. And not just for the participants, but also for you. So that's why being trauma informed is essential. And I think we always need to emphasize how essential it is, because it's not only for protecting the participants, but it's only also for protecting yourself. So I think it's always come around when you are preparing for the implementation of your research methods. It comes around, you need to do the same question, ask yourself the same questions. What I will do if someone shares something deeply painful when I'm doing the project? How will I support them ethically and sensitively? And equally, how will I take care of myself when I carry these stories with me to home, for example? So I think there is always that elephant in the room that is called vicarious trauma, and I think it's real, and I think it helps quietly, yeah, when we are working in these kind of spaces. And if we don't acknowledge it always catch up with us. And that's what I think that creative research methods, it's really insightful here, because you will bring emotional weight, but you will need to be well trained and prepared and how to build systems that support, not only the participants, but also like it's going to support you. So as I was saying, this like is some of the main challenges. Epistemic injustice is something that you face a lot when you're working like this, because people experiences are doubted, are misrepresented, are filtered through frameworks that all that don't reflect, the reality. And I think creative methods challenge that. So they allow participants that they are the ones that define what matters, is their voice, and how they are sharing their voice, how there is interpreted their voice. I think that's very important when we're shifting the power and we are trying to take the power away from researcher, from Western structures, and more towards the people. So from theory to practice, I think a trauma-informed approach doesn't start at the interview. I think it starts at the design stage. And I think it's important if we ask if we are including participants in shaping, for example, the questions of our research. We are thinking about methods that make them feel safe or accessible or empowering. So for example, a drawing session can make a person feel safer than a structured interview, or a narrative storytelling. And it can give you more information than a questionnaire. So it's how we do that, and how also we prepare ourselves in the process. So the reflexibility, thinking about who we are, what is our why we're interested in this type of projects, and our biases and our privileges. I think it also help us, in holding space in an honest way. And I think it's also important that we use the methods intentionally. And I think creative approaches is not something, or shouldn't be treated as something that is trendy or important right now for the moment. I think it should be selected with care, and it should be selected based on the needs of the community. I think the nature of the topic, the community needs, the emotional landscape of the work that you are getting. I think those are things that should be considered when I'm selecting the method. So if I'm working with people, for example, that have experienced medical trauma, in my case, I created approach like body mapping or narrative mapping can allow them to reclaim the timeline or the agency of their story, rather than, for example, being structured by me. And I think that's why it's important. Or when I have been working with people that are refugees, and they don't have like other, like my same language. So, and I see that the language is a barrier, so I use image based or art based methods, because they can reduce the dependency on the verbal fluency, and we won't have that barrier. And I see that it can help as an entry point in my research. So I try not to ask what method do I like, what method is going to be easier, but I rather ask which method is going to support them more, or giving them more agency, which method is going to give them more voice or amplify their voices, and which method is going to make them feel safer. in the context that I'm doing the research. I think that's why for me, trauma informed care and creative research methods are always going to be, taking hands. So here it comes, language and expression, that I found it's very important too. And I think language is never neutral, especially in health research, and we know that. And it thinks that it often reflects clinical systems, but it doesn't reflect life realities, life experiences. And this was a quote that stood with me in one of my projects. And is, I have lived with this for 40 years. I get to decide what is called. And that really stuck with me, because naming it isn't just like about description, but it's about identity, it's about control, and it's about dignity. And I think that creative methods allow people to communicate in their own terms, in their own rhythm, in their own style. And this is especially important for people who have often been misunderstood, misrepresented, silenced by the system. And I think we allow for creative expression, and that we are just not collecting data, but we are returning the ownership to the participant, to the community. For example, I come from an indigenous community in Colombia, and for us, ownership of our stories, of our land, our way of living, it is something that we crave so much after everything that we have experienced. So that's why I think language and the ownership that we give to the stories of the people through language is very, very powerful. Because I think that language can harm, but it also can heal, and it's how we use it in research. That's how it matters a lot. So, relationship of trust. So, I think trust is the foundation of ethical research, and it's something that we build through consistency, through respect, and to being present. And this is why I come up with this also, a quote from my research for my projects, and is, when I felt like the researcher actually care about me, not just my answers, that's when I open up. And I think creative methods often involve that we need to be slower than usual. We need to have collaborative work, which creates more room for connection. That is something that we're missing every time more and more. And I think when we treat participants as co-creator, not just as data sources, that's how trust grows. And that's the quality also and the depth of our research. So creative, and participatory approaches is the way that allow people to process the trauma without having to relieve it in a verbal way. I think it offers something that for me traditional interviews don't offer. It's why I like this quote. I couldn't say it in words, but I could feel it in the colors. And it captures what creative approaches make possible. That is not just collect information, but is making room for meaning, for healing, for a voice. These are some common creative methods that I have used. For example, to photo voice, usually I use it when I try to reflect. When I see that there is a need to reflect the realities or the daily struggles of the person, narrative and body mapping. I use it a lot in clinical research. Yeah, poetry when the participants experiences, they're difficult to say, and there is needs to feel those experiences, the agency, and the drawing with this. Not the person is not able to express it with words. And I think all these methods have in common is that they center the participant as a creator and just not as a respondent of a research. And they are able to communicate in their own terms. And I think that for people who has experienced loss or who have experienced violence, marginalization, I think that act of creation is not just expressive, but I think it's, or I have found it in my projects, that is deeply reparative. So this is one of my reflections that I always I have this quote in my desk when I'm designing the projects. And it's that trust isn't built in the questions, it's built in how you ask them. And that reminds me every time that methods are not neutral. And for me, creativity is a form of care. And finally, towards a reparative research. And I think that we often say do no harm, but what if research could go further? That's what I want to say. What if we could support healing, expression, and empowerment? And I think that for me, that's what reparative research aims to do. And I think creative methods help us to stay in a relationship with participants, and a relationship that is just not for the development of the project, but it's because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's one of the most important things when we are doing these projects. Finally, I would love to have your thoughts after this, and that you think in your job, what cool or what does holding a space look like in your work? How can creative methods support more inclusive and ethical practices in your research? And what will it mean to create research that leave people feeling seen and not studied? And I think that's very important that we consider. Okay, so that will be the end of my presentation. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was fantastic. It was really great to hear about the kind of real range of creative methods that you're using in your work and how you're doing it in a way that, yeah, is trauma informed, but also kind of facilitating, um, you know, kind of well-being and transformation in people as well. I'm going to come to Kate, in the chat. Kate, would you be happy to read out your question? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm currently doing a PhD on disability and social inclusion in urban nature, and I'm puzzling with myself really how I can sort of be quite explicit to get participants for my study, so that they understand. I would hope it's not going to be an extractive process, and that they understand that, you know, when time is of an essence, and, you know, obviously there's pressures to get the project done, and often there doesn't seem to be any time to build that trust up, so to crack on and get your interviews done. And I'm also curious to know, we sit within the medical school, and obviously to even get through ethical approval has been quite draining, frankly, because certainly as a disabled researcher myself, being very explicit, having to pathologize people, that where the ethical process itself seems so strict that actually to even talk about being creative is just one step too far, really.
If I understood correctly, Kate, like your question is about how you try to overcome to these challenges. Yeah. I think the main issue, it comes when I try to implement some language that is as depathologizing as possible, as inclusive as possible. But then I have to present a total different language to the funders and a total different language to the ethical committees. And the requirement of a funding to be very exact, precise with the timing, but that's not the reality of a project, because I'm taking time of people and I'm not their priority in their life, and I totally understand that, but that's not something that can be well represented in the funding. So I think your struggle is the struggle of all of us, that we are trying to make this work. And I try to, when it comes to funding, and with talking with the funding officers and with who is funding my project, I try to come from us that we agreed that if I want to develop a project that is going to be trauma informed, there are certain things that cannot be strict, or certain methodologies that I will need to be flexible, because I'm working with people like time and experiences. everything can change, especially results that I was, or deliverables that I was expecting to give. It cannot be strict in how I'm framing them, because those deliverables may not be as I want them to be. So if I had in mind certain structure, what it comes with creative methods is that we don't know what is gonna pop up. I may have some questions that I wanted to develop with the project, but the participants, that has happened many times to me, told me like, that's not the question, or that's not the issue. You are in the surface, but the issue is this. And it totally changed the baseline of my project. And I have had to go back to the funder and saying like, look, this is what happened. And that's not what I didn't expect that. And I think that's the beauty of creative methods, but it's also quite an issue because we are trying to use methods that are with the realities and life experiences of the people, but we are still in a Western system that is very colonizing, and that it asks us for being structured and for being rational, and to don't involve too much on the project. But that's impossible, because there is something that is in you to develop that project because you like it, and just that idea is going to push you to develop the project. And that's where rationality doesn't come around. And the fact that I want to stay 1 hour after the interview with the person, having a coffee and telling her that everything is okay, that's part of the project, and that's building a relationship of trust. And that's not neutrality, that's being human, and we are humans. And that's what research creative methods go around, like this, that experience, but that experience that academia and like a Western way of what is worth it, so they told me like, this type of research is not as worth it as a research that has a strict methodology. But then what it defines what is worth it and what is not worth it. If my research helped the person or the community to heal, besides giving me data, but it helped them to heal and to understand the issue and the dynamic, and then what is not worth it as other research that may just have an interview and a questionnaire and gave you a lot of data, but it didn't help the community. So I think that the problem is like, we are trying to develop something for the community, but still the system is asking for something that I don't know, is not that meaningful for them.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Kate, for your question. That was great. Charlie, am I okay to come to you? You've asked a question in the chat. Are you okay to? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi there. Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Yessica. Yeah, that was a brilliant presentation. Yeah, really thought-provoking. I have a couple of questions, I guess more about practicalities, really. So, when you're designing a study and you're exploring what methods to use with participants, can you talk a bit more about how those negotiations sort of work in practice? So, do you present, I don't know, a potential menu of options that could be used, or are you kind of very, very much led by the ideas of potential participants? Yeah, could you talk about that bit, please? Thanks.
Okay, so the first thing that I do is I study deeply the history of the community, and I think that helps a lot to know around it. So my doctoral thesis is around genital mutilation. So when I was studying the community, I studied history, the activism, everything that has done around it, legal frameworks, and what they have said, a great literature. Because if I know what's the history, if I can understand what's the history, I can have a better idea of where they have been silenced, where are the main issues. So in this case, I was working with medicalization and pathologization. So there is like a problem with agency of the bodies. There is a problem with language that never give you the voice that it pathologizes. So I know that language will be a problem. I know that, for example, body representation will be a problem, So those are things that I will have in mind because I learned the history and I see that these are the problems. So for example, if I do with this community something just with language, I may not get good results because they already have bad experience with language, because since they were children, they were treated around that pathologizing language. So language is not something that they like too much because they had issues with the language. Yeah. So in that case, I try to use creative methods that don't have too much language. So in that case, I use, for example, body mapping, and it came amazing because they could express here, this is how they treated my body. This is how they make me vulnerable. This is how they remove my dignity. Yeah. So then I saw that it was really the problem. I tried to go around it. So I use that. So then I see when I see that in this case the body was a problem and the language was a problem. So I see that's how I go. When I see that there is a lot of again, I study the history and I see there is a lot of trauma, and trauma that is difficult, that it comes with shame, and that is difficult to speak up about it. So then I try to see which methods around drawing can I have, yeah, and which did the community have, for example, some different way of expression. I go around it. So we usually do different exercises. Again, I have a baseline, as I'm telling you, that what I think it may work, but I usually do different exercises. Like I run different workshops where I do 2 or 3 with some participants, 2 or 3 methods. Most of the time it works as I was expecting because I study well the community, so I could manage to make the link, and effectively drawing was what I think is going to work, or the other one. But it can happen that no, that, or they come out with another one. I had a community that I had an idea that I was doing to drawing, and then when I was like in the practice of the workshop, one of them told me, we feel very connected with music, and then we realized that we can do it through music and through songs that were revealing all the trauma that they had. So because that the community, they used to play, they have like different bangos and instruments that they used to do. So through the songs we could put it, and then it was amazing because we managed to create like a full map, and wherever they were vulnerable, we managed to do like the song, and it was so powerful. So I think that I had a totally different idea. Again, they changed it, and it is that. But usually it starts, or for me, it starts studying well the history in the community, and then it's how we see which method can adapt.
Well, that's so helpful. Thank you so much, Yessica. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Martin, I think you've just posted a question in the chat. Martin, would you be happy to come onto the mic and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering about the use of the use of the creativity. I think we often describe them as like a whole method or a methodological approach, but I kind of don't see them as that. I kind of see them as lots of tools that we use, as we might use any other methodological tool, and they can be applied, like something like journey mapping or process mapping. There's a very quantitative way to use that, but also there's a very participatory way to use that. And they're different paradigms, and you can't necessarily, during one research project, you can't jump from one paradigm to the next. You just can't, because they're totally different ways of thinking. One relies on participatory methods, allows participants to decide the end goal, ideally to decide the end goal, to decide what they offer up, whereas a qualitative method kind of is more directive, more extractive than that. So I wondered, am I right thinking along those lines? And yeah, and even you can use some of the creative tools to do quantitative work. So I don't think there's I don't know, I've forgotten the question. Even when I was trying to reread it and it didn't come across very well written, sorry, the question. But I'm just like trying to ask something about that these creative tools don't belong to one particular paradigm. They can be used across paradigms, right?
Yes, I think as you said, it's not something that one size fits all, and it's not something that we can have strict methodology around it. I think it's something that it can be shaped community needs, and also what you want to get with the project, and how far you want to dig and you want to go around it. And of course, when I'm doing qualitative methodology, it's easier for me to implement creative methods. I know that in quantitative, I struggle because it's even more like the methodology is strict, and it comes with data and how it has to be done and how the information had to be processed. And as you said, that there always going to be a way that I can be creative around it, how I can design the questionnaire in a way, or how I can use the language in a way that is as inclusive as possible and that respect people's history. So it's exactly as you said, as you framed, how I can be creative in the little space that I will have to design it. It's not just as doing the whole project creative. If I cannot do it, it's okay. But how the little spaces that I'm gonna have, I can do them as creative as possible in a way that people can feel like seen or heard in those spaces in our research.
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thanks, Martin, for that interesting question. Yeah, definitely. Has anyone else got any questions? Does anyone else want to raise their hand? We've got a bit of time actually, which is quite nice for this. Thank you, Jessica, for providing lots of time for us to think about kind of questions, and maybe we can start thinking about some of those questions that you posed to us as well, Jessica. You had 3 questions, weren't they? Could you just repeat them so maybe we can have a bit of a think about them?
Yes. And it was like about what does holding a space look like in your work, and how can creative methods support more inclusive ethical practices in your research, and what will it mean to create research that leaves people feeling seen and not studied. And I think that's something that comes with creative methods, that it take us it not only challenges the participants, but it also challenges us, So how we go beyond what usually is expected, because it's always expected just to give deliverables, and give things that is gonna go with the project. But how we manage to go beyond in your research and provide some sort of healing that is usually not something common when we are designing a project. It's the last thing that is going to come up. So I'm going to go and interview a community that has been marginalized, that has suffered, pathologized. So I'm going to take the information and I'm going to see how I give this information for a public toolkit, and to give it so the policymakers can do something about it. But what about if during the development of a research we can do something about it there, and we can help them a little bit, maybe providing some healing, or change the shift and telling them, this is not your fault, this is power structures, this is power dynamics, this is the injustice of the system. So how we can do that in the research, I think that's something that we should think within the design of our project, how we can go a little bit beyond what is expected from us and more towards what
Exactly, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about that in my own work in terms of the last question, what would it mean to do research that makes people kind of heal, or yeah, feel more seen rather than extracted from. And that was really what my kind of PhD research tried to do, working with people who were living with kind of long-term health conditions, mental health challenges, like domestic violence, survivors and that kind of thing, using kind of meditation and mindfulness based practices to support people to heal effectively, to kind of get themselves out of that real like self-blame, self-criticism, shame dynamic that comes from trauma, I think. And yeah, so I found that these practices can be quite kind of transformational for people, and people were transformed through them and kind of heal, like we're on that journey of healing. Particularly one participant who, throughout the kind of very active creative methods process where we did like body mapping and practice meditation and stuff, she was really struggling. But then I've kind of followed up with them 6 months later, and she was one of the participants who just, her whole like embodiment and energy had completely changed because, through being part of this community in the research, but then also after that, continuing to build those relationships and practice things that were supportive. Like she found, I guess, through the research, she found the tools that she needed in order to live a life that was more supportive for her, I guess. And that was really amazing to see. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in these methods. But I also wondered if you could talk a little bit about like some of the challenges that you've had using creative methods, because you know, when I've applied to undertake research using creative methods, some of the kind of replies I've had from funders and that kind of thing is how will you ensure that, you know, they've always asked me to think more clearly about some of the ethical challenges of undertaking creative methods. They don't see it as necessarily whilst they're not really thinking about institutional ethics, which I know you were thinking a lot about in your presentation. They're more thinking about like everyday ethics, and when I guess creative methods can maybe open up too much for participants. And I know that in your presentation you're talking a lot about kind of holding space, but maybe you can give us some like practical examples of how you hold that space, like whether you're supported in holding that space as well, and what kind of self-care things that you do for yourself in order to make sure you're well enough to hold that space for participants who are experiencing trauma.
Yeah, I think for example, mm, those in some of my projects, we managed to get funding for counseling sessions for days that after the creative method participants get some counseling because of what came up. Of course, there are certain things that we can support. We can't do too much about it. But also you need to be ready what you are uncovering. So we managed to get some counseling sessions, help in case that they needed, and then we gave them those counseling sessions, and it helped a lot in times of ethical questions that help. And I think also the informed consent and how we express that informed consent. It was also constant. Let's say in my projects, I was also always people with creative methods and the participants. They usually don't expect the results. They are as shocked as you many times. So what they draw or what they say, what they wrote, or how it happened is something that it also they didn't see it coming. And I think that's why in creative methods the consent has to be always constant, and telling the person it's okay if you don't want me to have this for the project. It's okay if you want to withdraw the drawing or remove it, even it's going to be anonymized. But if you just don't want to share it, you want to keep it for you, or the poem and everything. The majority of the cases, they always allow me to keep the work as deliverables of the project. But I think it was because you show with a relationship of trust that you are beyond a deliverable, and you are beyond an interview, but you really care for the result of what that's going to have in the person, and not only for the result of your project. Yeah. So I think that's something very important when it comes to build ethical practices that are human rights informed and that are trauma informed. And yes, these ethical practices may have the risk that you ended up not with the same amount of data that if you have had a strict protocol. It may be the risk, but that's the risk that you take when you are really working and listening the voices of the people. And sometimes people don't want to tell their stories at some point, and you need to respect that, because it's their stories, it's not your story, and it's their life experiences, and they're the ones that want to see how that life experience is gonna be seen or heard or not. So they are not prepared yet. So I think it's part of the conversation that we always need to have with the funding that we are going to be kind of the same page, because that's quite an issue. We usually, as we were talking in the first question, we usually are not in the same page. So it's how we can create a balance on that, because it's difficult, but at some point, that's the idea of these spaces, that we bring every time more and more this discussion in the academia, to realize that through examples we can prove that this is as worth it as any other type of research methodology, and therefore it has the risks, but also it can be deeply transformative, not only for the community, but also for the results of the research. The research that I have had have proved to be, the results have proved to be really important, and then transformational, and and then useful for policymaking.
Yeah, and I think it's really refreshing to hear. I don't know, just be, because I often think it's not about how much data you. I often like push back on the need, the pressure of collecting loads and loads of data, because I think that then gets you into those extractive researcher brain where you're like, I must mine these people's experiences for as much data as possible, but rather thinking like, is it appropriate? Yeah, that process consent, is it appropriate to be, yeah, asking this of my participants right now, that kind of thing. Great. And then Martin, you had another question around a kind of glass ceiling effect on our career, in terms of, could you articulate that a little bit more about what kind of dimension you were thinking about that from?
Yeah, I think because we know it happens with people that worked with vulnerable communities in the past and that use qualitative methods in the past, because they weren't so highly cited and not so highly respected. So you would kind of reach a point in your career where you couldn't advance anymore because you weren't getting the ref score that you wanted, or because it just wasn't respected. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on if that is a factor in creative methods and participatory methods, or.
Yeah, I think it comes with the idea that, or I have faced that a lot in different academic spaces, especially in public health, and it's the idea that is not this research is not as valid and as a research that strict methodology, and that's one of the problems. And it's a structural problem, and it's a problem that comes from how they teach us in the PhD that research should be done. The role of a researcher, what is the role of a participant or a subject of the study, and they teach us that's how it has to be, that's how it has to work. And I think, yes, in career wise, there are still, every time they ask you that the publishing papers at this time, and it needs to have certain regulation, the paper, and needs to have this type of pages and data, and that's how the data has to be explained. And a lot of journals, for example, they rejected the work because they don't consider it valid enough, because it doesn't have the strict methodology. And that's why I consider that this type of spaces, it helps to start bringing up the conversation that it's worth it, and that the methodology is different, but the fact that it's different, it doesn't mean that it's not valid, that it has also a weight, and it's a way that respects the community. And the more we bring the conversation, the more used to it's going to be, like, for journals and for people and for professors to start considering this as important as other Western methodology.
And I hope that, yeah, this seminar series will help boost that kind of as well, by profiling work like yours, Yessica, that allows, that does this important kind of participatory and community-based work with kind of groups that maybe they don't have a voice or a platform to kind of share their experiences. So yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for today. I'm going to draw this to a close, just so people have got time to pop off to their other meetings and things this afternoon. But it's been a real pleasure to have you with us here today, Yessica. I've really enjoyed hearing about your work, and some of the kind of ways that you're navigating, these kind of difficult structures that kind of both limit the work that we can do, but also we need to kind of push back on, and yeah, just sending you loads of solidarity with that work, and I'm sure other people on this call are too. So thanks again so much, everybody. This is the last formal like booked in session in the series. There might be a couple more if speakers are available, and if you know of anyone that would like to speak, please get in touch. But for now, yeah, this is the end, and I've already put the link to the YouTube on the in the chat, so please do go via that link if you've missed any and you want to catch up from last time. But thanks again, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day and afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.